Silas Thorne drove the shovel into the hard autumn ground with both hands, then leaned his weight on it as the wind came hard across the Wyoming prairie. Dust lifted around his boots. The trench beside him stretched like a wound through the yellow grass, straight from the north wall of the cabin toward the barn. Two riders slowed on the road and stared. Silas did not look up. He only wiped his brow, set the shovel again, and kept cutting into the earth as if his life already depended on what he was building. By sundown, the trench looked too long to be called a mistake and too strange to be called ordinary work. His little girls stood near the porch in their shawls, watching their father disappear below ground and rise again with another shovelful of dirt. His wife, Eleanor, held the door half open behind them, with warm firelight falling across the boards. Out on the road, someone laughed and rode on. Silas heard it. He kept digging. What did he know about the coming winter that nobody else did? The people in that part of Wyoming started talking before he was even halfway done. It was the fall of 1919, and a man digging a trench between his cabin and his barn was not something folks could ignore. They saw the line of it from the county road. They saw the stone he stacked, the lumber he hauled, the roof frame rising low over the cut in the earth. Men at the trading post shook their heads and called it foolish. Others called it fear. By the end of the week, somebody had already given it a name. Thorne's folly. Silas never answered them. He was 28 years old, quiet by nature, and quieter still since returning from the Great War. But he had not come west to win arguments. He had come with Eleanor and their two daughters to find room to breathe, to put distance between his family and the old thunder that still lived in his mind. He had seen enough of noise, enough of men shouting, enough of ground torn open by desperation. Out here, he wanted sky, work, and a place where his girls might sleep without fear. But their first winter on the prairie had taught him that peace and comfort were not the same thing. Their cabin looked strong enough from the outside. The logs were tight. The stone chimney stood firm. There was a loft where the girls slept under quilts Eleanor had sewn herself. In fair weather, it even looked cheerful, with smoke lifting from the chimney and the barn standing close by like a trusted neighbor. But once the winter of 1918 set in, the truth showed itself. The north wind did not simply blow past the cabin. It struck it. It came across miles of open prairie with nothing to slow it. Day after day and all through the night, it beat on the cabin wall as if it meant to scrape the heat right out of the logs. Silas fed the firebox every few hours until his eyes burned with sleep. He cut and burned wood at a pace that seemed impossible for a house so small. Still, the inside never felt truly warm. The cold settled into everything. His daughters slept in their coats and knitted caps, small faces buried in blankets. Eleanor pushed old rags into the cracks near the floor each evening, and by morning those same rags were stiff with frost. Ice formed on the inside wall in pale white feathers. The water bucket in the corner often froze solid before dawn. When sometimes Eleanor stood at the stove in 2 shawls and a coat just to make breakfast. There was no ease in that winter, only a thin line between living and freezing. Silas noticed everything. He noticed where the snow drifted and where it did not. He noticed how the east and west sides gathered white piles, but the north side was often stripped nearly bare by the force of the wind. He noticed how a still, cold night felt cruel enough, but a windy one stole twice as much strength from the house and the people inside it. He had seen this kind of battle before, only in another country, in another life. In France, he had worked as a combat engineer. He had dug where men needed shelter. He had studied earth, drainage, pressure, and the many ways weather could kill a man faster than bullets if he underestimated it. Out there, that survival had belonged to the men who paid attention, not the proud ones, not the loud ones, the careful ones. One night late that first winter, after the girls had finally drifted off to sleep, Silas sat near the fire sharpening a pencil with his pocket knife. Eleanor was mending one of the girls' sleeves. The room was dim except for the fire and one lamp. Frost clung to the window corners. Silas drew a line on a scrap of wood and stared at it for a long time. Eleanor looked up at him. "What is it?" He tapped the north wall with the pencil. "It isn't the cold doing all the stealing." She waited. "It's the wind," he said softly. "The cold is bad enough, but the wind keeps pulling the heat away before the house can hold it." Eleanor glanced toward the wall as if she could hear the memory of that hard winter still pressing there. "Oh, can anything stop it?" Silas did not answer at once. He drew another line, then another, making a rough shape between two small boxes. Maybe. That word sat between them for a while. When the weather softened, he began planning. By late summer, when an army surplus sale offered rough lumber and corrugated metal cheap enough for a man with more thought than money, he bought what he could and hauled it home. Then he started digging. He dug the trench below the frost line, 4 feet down. He laid gravel for drainage because he had learned long ago that trapped water ruined good work faster than bad weather. He built low stone walls from fieldstone taken off his own land. Then he framed the passage low and wide, joining cabin to barn with a covered corridor that looked to outsiders like the beginning of a burrow. But it was not just a walkway. It was a shield. Each day he piled the excavated earth against the outer walls of the connector until the sides were banked nearly to the roof. Packed soil rose along it like the body of a long sleeping beast. By the time he was done, the thing hardly looked built at all. It looked grown from the prairie itself. Eleanor stood beside him the evening the shape finally made sense. The light was fading. The sky in the north had gone pale and hard, the color of coming cold. She wrapped her shawl close. "It looks strange," she said. Silas brushed dirt from his hands and studied the line from barn to cabin. "It'll do its job." She looked toward the road, where sooner or later somebody would ride by and laugh again. "People are going to talk." He kept his eyes on the north horizon. "Oh, let them." They did more than talk. Calvin Dreyer from the sawmill rode out and circled the structure with the heavy doubt of a man used to being right. He kicked at the packed earth with his boot and warned Silas about rot, trapped moisture, and buried wood. At the trading post, Hank Miller laughed loud enough for the whole room to hear and called it a coward's corridor. At church, women offered Eleanor those small smiles that hid more judgment than kindness. Even her own brother Thomas came by one Sunday and told Silas in a low, serious voice that a man's reputation mattered out here. Silas listened to all of it with the same still face. Then one evening, after Thomas had ridden away and the light had gone from the yard, Eleanor found Silas standing inside the finished corridor. One end opened toward the barn, and the other met the cabin. The air inside was cool, but it was calm. No gusts, no whistle through cracks, no bite. He stood there in the hush, one hand on the post, as if listening to something only he could hear. Eleanor stepped beside him. "Do you really think this will save us?" For the first time that day, he looked tired. He turned his gaze toward the cabin door, where warm lamplight touched the floorboards and the faint voices of their daughters floated out from inside. Then he looked north, toward the dark, open prairie, and the season moving slowly toward them. "Yes," he said. A week later, the first hard cold came down from the north. November did not arrive gently that year. It came down hard and fast, as if the sky had decided to skip mercy. The first real freeze locked the water troughs in a single night. Well, then the wind rose and stayed. By the second week of December, the whole valley seemed trapped under a white, bitter weight. Snow packed against fences until they looked swallowed. The road to the trading post turned into a rough, pale track that vanished and reappeared under drifting snow. Even the strong men stopped talking about weather, as if it were a thing to be endured. Now they spoke of it as if it were an enemy. Inside most cabins, the same battle was being fought. Fires had to be fed without rest. Mothers kept children wrapped in coats by the hearth. Men woke in darkness to throw on more wood, then lay back down, still cold in their bones. Green logs hissed and smoked in stoves. Wet gloves steamed by the fire and froze stiff again by morning. Chimneys coughed black smoke into a sky already dark with storm, and every family measured its fear by the size of the woodpile and how fast it was shrinking. At the Thorne place, the storm came too. It beat the barn roof. It swept over the buried corridor. It screamed across the prairie and shoved snow against every fence and outbuilding it could find. But when it reached the north side of the cabin, it found something different waiting there. It found earth, timber, and stillness. The first night the temperature dropped below zero, Silas sat at the table with his hat off and his sleeves rolled to the wrist. Eleanor noticed it before she said anything. The girls were near the fire, drawing crooked little horses on scraps of paper. The room was not hot, but it was steady. No cold breath slipped through the walls. No frost spread across the logs. The air felt dry and settled. But Eleanor crossed slowly to the wall where frost had once formed like lace. There was none. She put her palm against the logs. Cool, yes, but not cruel. Not burning cold like before. Not wet. Not dangerous. She turned and looked at him. "Silas." He raised his eyes from the ledger where he had been marking down the day's wood use. "What is it?" Her face was full of surprise, though she kept her voice low so the girls would not hear the fear that still lived behind it. "It's holding." Silas closed the ledger and listened for a moment. The storm was still outside. They could hear it in the distance, pushing at the world beyond the walls. But inside the cabin, the sound came to them dulled and broken. The house no longer felt exposed. It felt sheltered. "That's the point," he said quietly. The days that followed grew colder still. Once at the Colby place, a child took sick with a deep cough that would not leave. Thomas and his wife started melting snow on the stove because their pump had frozen. Hank Miller burned through good seasoned hardwood so fast he began cursing each log before he threw it in. Calvin Dreyer made emergency runs with his sleigh, hauling cordwood to families who had planned carefully and were still losing ground. Every conversation at the trading post turned to cold, wood, frozen stock, weak calves, and whether the worst had yet come. It had. By the middle of December, the valley was under siege. The cold no longer felt natural. It felt personal. The air itself seemed sharpened. Men pulled scarves over their mouths and still felt their teeth ache. Horses came in with frost on their lashes. Chickens froze on roosts if the coop was not sealed tight enough. Cows huddled in lean-tos, sides trembling, breath hanging around them like smoke. The snow packed so hard in places that a boot heel barely marked it. Cabin doors had to be shouldered open against the drifts. Sleep came in scraps because every fire wanted tending before the night was through. And still, at the Thorne cabin, something strange was happening. The chimney gave off only a thin gray ribbon of smoke, nothing like the thick black plumes pouring from the homes of desperate families feeding their stoves too hard. The girls no longer wore coats indoors. Eleanor cooked in an apron with only a shawl over her shoulders in the mornings. The water bucket near the wall stayed liquid until dawn. At night, for the first time since coming west, the family slept for more than a few hours at a stretch, without Silas rising again and again to fight the fire. What they had inside that cabin was more than warmth. It was rest. One afternoon during a lull in the storm, a rider passed the Thorne place and slowed near the gate. He meant only to see whether the family was still standing. What he saw instead made him pull his horse short. Silas stepped out of the barn and crossed through the corridor entrance toward the cabin, carrying a pail in one hand. He was bareheaded. Worse than that, he was in shirt sleeves. The rider stared as if he had seen madness. The snow around the mound lay deep and bright under the pale sky. The wind still swept the open ground beyond the buildings, but Silas moved in and out of the connector without struggle, like a man walking through ordinary weather, and he disappeared inside the cabin door. A moment later, the rider kicked his horse onward and headed for town with a story he could hardly believe himself. By evening, the trading post was buzzing. "Shirt sleeves," one man repeated. "In that cold? He'll lose his senses next." "No," another said. "Maybe he already has." But beneath the mockery, something else had crept in. Curiosity. On December 23rd, the cold turned savage even by Wyoming standards. The morning came in iron gray, with the wind cutting across the valley like broken glass. Calvin Dreyer had been up before dawn loading his sleigh with wood for families who had nearly run out. He moved with the heavy purpose of a man who had no time left for pride. On his list was the Thorne place. He told himself he was going there out of duty. Silas had a wife, 2 little girls. Whatever foolish thing he had built, no man could keep a family safe in weather like this. Calvin was sure of it. He loaded a quarter cord of seasoned oak onto the sleigh, lashed it tight, and headed out through the blowing snow. The ride was miserable. Snow found every opening in his coat. The wind clawed at his face until his eyes watered. By the time he pulled up at the cabin, his beard was crusted white and his fingers ached even through his gloves. He climbed down stiffly, looked once at the long, earth-covered connector was between barn and house, and shook his head. "Lord help fools," he muttered. He carried himself to the cabin door and knocked hard. The door opened almost at once. Eleanor stood there. For a moment, Calvin did not understand what had happened. He expected to see misery, smoke, panic, children wrapped in quilts, the worn-out face of a woman too proud to ask for help. Instead, the first thing he felt was the warmth that moved out through the open door and settled over him like another season. Not blast furnace heat. Not the sharp heat of a stove run too hard. This was calm warmth, dry warmth, steady warmth. He stared past Eleanor into the room. The 2 girls sat at the table with bits of paper and stubs of pencil. They were not bundled in coats. They wore simple dresses with wool stockings and looked up at him with the easy curiosity of children who had not spent the day shivering. Near the hearth, a modest fire burned with no fury in it. The room held no smoke, no dampness, no smell of desperation. Eleanor saw his eyes move from the girls to the room and then back to the wood stacked on his sleigh. "That's kind of you, Calvin," she said softly. but we're all right." He opened his mouth and found no words waiting for him. Silas came in through the cabin door that led to the corridor, a full pail in one hand and cold air following him only for a breath before the door shut again. He wore a work shirt, no coat. His face was calm, though there was a tiredness in it that came from labor, not panic. Calvin turned toward him slowly. "How?" he asked. Silas set the pail down by the table. "Come in out of the wind." Calvin stepped inside because his body obeyed before his pride could stop it. His boots sounded too loud on the floor. He took off one glove and flexed his aching fingers in the warm room like a man testing whether the feeling was real. His gaze fell on the thermometer hanging near the window. He walked toward it. The mercury sat clear and steady. 68 degrees. Calvin stared at the number so long that it began to feel like an insult to everything he thought he knew. Outside, the cold was deep enough to kill stock and crack water pails. Inside this small cabin, a family sat warm enough for children to draw in peace. He turned back to Silas, and there was no mockery left in his face now. "What are you burning?" he said. Silas glanced toward the hearth. "Pine, cottonwood, whatever the place gives us." Calvin frowned. "How much?" Silas looked toward the ledger on the shelf. "Less than a cord every 2 weeks." The room went still. Calvin felt something shift inside him then, something heavier than surprise. He had spent half the month hauling hardwood to cabins colder than this one, and families were burning more than twice that amount, and still waking to ice in their rooms. Yet here stood Silas Thorne, the quiet man everyone had laughed at, keeping his wife and daughters safe with less wood and more comfort than anybody in the valley. Calvin looked again at the thermometer, then at the girls, then at the north wall he had once warned would rot. He stepped toward it and placed his palm against the logs. Dry. No frost. No dampness. No deadly draft sneaking through. When he turned back, Silas was watching him with the same unreadable calm he had worn all autumn. Calvin swallowed once, hard. "Show me," he said. Silas did not answer right away. He picked up the lantern from the shelf, lit it, and moved toward the door that opened into the connector. Calvin followed in silence, still holding one glove in his hand like he had forgotten what it was for. When Silas opened the door, the air inside the passage felt cold, but it did not bite. That was the first thing Calvin noticed. It was winter in there, yes, but a quiet winter. No wind pushed at his coat. No snow swirled through cracks. No sharp whistle filled the space. The corridor stretched ahead in dim lantern light, low-roofed and still, with packed earth rising on both sides outside the framed walls. The sound of the storm was muted here, as if the prairie had been pushed far away. Silas lifted the lantern slightly. "This is where it changes." Calvin looked from one end of the connector to the other. "It's just a passage." "No," Silas said. "It's a wall made of still air and earth." He spoke plainly, without pride. That made the words land harder. The wind never reaches the north wall of the cabin now," he said. "It strikes this first. The earth holds steady. The air in here doesn't move much. That means the house doesn't keep losing heat every minute of the day." Calvin stood there listening to the silence around them. He had spent his whole life building against cold by throwing more fuel at it. More wood, bigger fires, thicker walls when possible, tighter seams. But this was something else. This was not feeding the loss. This was stopping it. Silas touched one of the posts with the back of his fingers. You can fight weather all winter and still lose, or you can change what the weather is allowed to touch. Calvin looked at him in the lantern light, and for the first time he saw what a nervous young veteran, not a frightened settler hiding from snow, all but an observant man who had spent one bitter winter learning what everybody else had accepted without question. They went back into the cabin. The warmth met them again, soft and steady. One of the girls had fallen asleep with her head on her folded arms at the table. Eleanor smiled faintly and moved to lift her. The other child stood by the fire, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Calvin watched them with a face that had gone strangely still. At last he said, "My house is 45 on its best day, and I'm burning oak fit for any stove in the territory." Silas said nothing. Calvin looked around the room once more, then shook his head slowly. "We've been doing this wrong for years." It was not an apology. Men like Calvin did not always know how to make those. But it was close enough to truth that Silas accepted it without asking for more. By the time Calvin climbed back onto his sleigh, the wind had started rising again. He did not leave the wood. He took it with him to a family who needed it more. He rode straight into town, and before nightfall, the valley had a new story to tell. Only this one was not laughter. It was wonder. Men at the trading post leaned in instead of leaning back. They asked Calvin how warm the cabin truly was. They asked what kind of stove Silas had, what fuel he was using, whether the family had some extra hidden heat source no one knew about. Calvin, who had once mocked the whole idea with professional certainty, gave them the number plainly. 68 degrees. The room had gone quiet after that. Hank Miller laughed at first, but the sound was weak and short. Thomas heard the story and said nothing at all. He simply stared into his coffee as though it had turned strange in the cup. The women who had pitied Eleanor began to look toward the Thorne place with something closer to respect. And all through that bitter holiday week, as families counted their remaining wood and prayed for milder weather, the mound between the Thorne cabin and barn took on a different shape in people's minds. It no longer looked foolish. It looked like an answer. A few days later, the county extension agent arrived. His name was Mr. Davies, and he came wrapped in layers with instruments packed carefully in the back of his wagon. He had heard too many impossible versions of the same story to ignore it. He was a serious man, not given to rumor, and he meant to see the truth for himself. Silas welcomed him in. Davies measured the outside air first, then the inside. He checked the thermometer twice, then checked his own instrument, as if one of them must be lying. After that, he went outside again and measured the open wind racing across the prairie. Then he stepped into the sheltered space beyond the corridor and measured there. The difference was so large he stopped writing for a moment and just stared at his notebook. Inside the cabin, he asked to see Silas's ledger. Silas handed it over. Every day since the first hard freeze, he had kept careful note of the outside temperature, the indoor temperature, and the amount of wood burned. No grand claims, no boasting. Just figures written in a steady hand by a man who trusted evidence more than opinion. And Davies read the pages slowly, then looked up with a new expression on his face. "This is not luck," he said. Silas shook his head once. "No." Davies spent nearly 2 hours there, examining the connector, the bermed earth, the drainage, the roof seams, the cabin wall, the stove, the barn's position to the north, every part of the design. When he finally left, he carried more than notes. He carried proof, and proof travels differently than gossip. The freeze did not break for weeks. It kept grinding down the valley, day after day, turning small mistakes into disasters and weak plans into suffering. But through all of it, the Thorne family held steady. The girls slept through the night. Eleanor cooked without trembling at the stove. Silas no longer rose every few hours to feed a hungry fire. For the first time since coming west, they were not merely enduring winter. They were living inside it with dignity. That was the part people remembered most. Not just the number on the thermometer, not just the smaller woodpile. It was the image of comfort where there should have been misery. Children warm enough to draw. A woman standing in her own kitchen without a coat. A man crossing between barn and cabin with his sleeves rolled and no fear in his step. Those things stayed in people's minds because they touched something deeper than envy. They touched relief. When the worst of winter finally loosened its grip in January, the first man to come asking was Thomas. He rode up one pale afternoon with his hat in his hands and his pride working hard inside him. He stood near the fence for a moment before coming the rest of the way. Silas met him outside, while Thomas looked at the corridor, then at the cabin, then at his brother-in-law. "Show me how it works," he said. Silas did. They spent the afternoon at the table with pencil and scrapboards, drawing lines, measuring distances, talking about wind, walls, and the value of still air. Thomas listened more than he spoke. He did not offer excuses for what he had said in the fall. He did not need to. The asking itself was enough. That spring, he built a simpler version near his own cabin. Not a full connector, not a buried corridor, but a deep northern windbreak set to create a buffer of calmer air before the weather struck the house. The next winter, his wood use fell hard enough to silence every remaining doubter in his yard. After that, the change came slowly, then all at once. But one family built a tall storage lean-to along the north side of their house. Another raised a heavy wall and packed earth against it. A third copied Silas more closely and connected a shed to a cabin with a covered passage. By the following winter, the valley looked different. Cabins were no longer standing naked against the prairie wherever a man's pride said they ought to. People began to build with the wind in mind. Even the name changed. No one said Thorne's Folly anymore. Some called it the Wyoming Wall. Others called it the Thorne Design. Mr. Davies later published a bulletin about the method, dry in tone but clear in its findings. The idea spread beyond the valley, then beyond the county. Builders adapted it in other parts of Wyoming, then farther north and east across the plains. In time, the principle took root in places where no one knew the face of the quiet man who had first used it there. Years passed. The girls grew up. Winters came and went. The buried corridor weathered storm after storm and kept doing the thing it had always done best. It stood between a family and the force that meant to strip their heat away. When Silas was older, with gray in his hair and grandchildren underfoot, a young reporter traveled from Cheyenne to ask about the famous design. He expected a man full of invention and triumph. Instead, he found the same calm settler who had once ignored laughter on the road and kept digging. The reporter asked if he was proud of what he had created. Silas looked out over the prairie before answering. The wind was moving through the long grass. The old cabin still stood. The barn still stood. But between them, the earth-covered corridor rested low and plain beneath the sky. "This wasn't new," he said. "It was just true." The reporter waited. Silas's eyes stayed on the land. The earth holds steady. The wind steals. All I did was pay attention. That was the whole lesson in the end. The frontier did not care for pride by itself. It did not reward mockery, noise, or tradition just because it had been repeated a long time. It rewarded the people who watched closely, learned honestly, and changed when change meant survival. Silas Thorne had not beaten winter by being tougher than other men. He had beaten it by understanding what the winter was really doing. And because he understood it, his wife slept warm. His daughters drew by the fire in simple dresses while the storm raged outside. His home became a place of shelter instead of strain. That was why the story lasted. Not because one man built a tunnel, but because inside that strange earth-covered passage was something more powerful than stubbornness. There was love, turned into labor. There was fear, turned into wisdom. And there was a quiet kind of courage the prairie respected at last. If you believe stories still matter, go ahead and hit subscribe to Wild West Tales of Love. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thanks for watching.